Right. We've been hearing an awful lot so far about using data to find out who the customer is, what the customer's buying, what they might buy. But in this next session, we're going to look at using technology to actually improve customer touch points, in other words, how you treat the customer. And our first speaker is Abe Smith. He's the CEO of Dealflo, and I think he's going to be throwing down the gauntlet a bit about the various ways in which there are opportunities to use technology to change the way the customer journey happens at quite a few points. So I'd like to introduce Abe.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So last time I spoke here, I got the post-lunch slot, and this time I've got the very near to the bar slot. I don't know what that's telling me, if I'm going forwards or backwards. Let's assume forwards, because you're all awake. And so I'd start by a slight amendment to the title of what I'm going to talk about. Originally, I think I had in the schedule a very long and convoluted title about data. I'm frankly surprised that you're all here and there hasn't been a mass exodus. Actually, if I may simplify that title somewhat and get right to the nub, this chat is really about building a business on data, the good and the bad and the ugly, not necessarily in that order. So, if in the words of Monty Python, it's not a statement of the bleeding obvious, technology is changing our business rapidly. I am 50 this year. A year before my birth, the first ATM went in. It's so old that it's got a blue plaque on a wall somewhere. That tells us something. We do business as a company in China. I was flabbergasted to learn when I went past a KFC, our local guide told us, you can walk into a Kentucky Fried Chicken in China and pay with your smile. It doesn't rate your smile or anything like that. You don't have to smile harder for a bucket. But what it does do in the background, amazingly, is connect to Alibaba and the Alipay application, and it facially recognizes you and completes the transaction in the background. You smile, you get your chicken. That's kind of interesting. It is easier in China because they happen to have a very comprehensive record of everybody's face. But the technology is there. It's also there in this country. Many of you will be aware of the developments between Fiat Chrysler, also a client of ours, and Amazon, also a client of ours or a user of ours. And I think what's interesting about this tie-up is people are buying cars online. Again, I'm a bit old maybe for that, but I'd be interested by a show of hands in this room who would consider buying a car completely online without visiting a dealership? By show of hands. That's impressive. I can't even do a kind of random dichotomy of young versus old. I think it was a fairly distributed cross-section. And I think when Accenture did a survey of under 40s, they found a kind of similar result. 44% of folks last year would consider buying a car purely online. Interestingly, the year before, it was something like 35%. That's a rapid rate of change. It's not a great leap of the imagination between buying a car online and financing a car online. In fact, using the Dealflo service, Amazon some years ago launched a service where you could finance product online. The product wasn't a car, but the user experience is pretty similar. So, again, a risk of statement of the obvious, we are progressing into the digital economy, but I would say perhaps more rapidly than we might think. And that begs a question. And the question is, as finance companies, our stock in trade traditionally has been physical processes and paper. The question is, what today really is our stock in trade? Any volunteers? You're all from the industry. Your stock in trade is a fundamental part of what you do. It's not a hard question. I may pick someone if I don't get a volunteer. Anyone from the auto finance industry. What is your stock in trade? Customer service? Is that really your stock in? Is that the typical subject or commodity a business uses or deals in? Money, okay. I would argue that's less your stock in trade, that's more something that facilitates the business between companies. Data, who said that? We have a prize for you at the end, sir. We don't have a prize. Your stock in trade is data. You are, and have been for some time, a virtualized industry, and we are getting more and more virtualized as we've seen as time passes. If KFC is becoming virtualized, we are a virtual industry. We should be streets ahead of them. And so, if we unpack that idea a little bit, look at the transaction. Look at the motor finance transaction. What does it constitute? The customer gets something. You get something. What the customer gets is nice and simple. Apparently non-branded, weird-looking car. But a car is something that we all more or less understand. A car is something which is not necessarily easily lost or hacked, save that thought, autonomous driving, or replicated. A car is a car is a car. But bits and bytes, that's different. That's far more ephemeral. That's, by its very nature, much harder to touch and understand. So let's think about that transaction and kind of unpack it a little bit more, the fundamental of your business as we've established. Many years ago, e-signature launched. Those of you who are our clients, I see many faces around here today, have been using things like electronic signature for some time. And at its very most basic, electronic signature can constitute two main things, I guess. There's a signature and there's a contract. Companies started to get more sophisticated and started to offer other stuff, other bits of data into the package. Things like identity verification, things like reporting, things like knowledge-based authentication, other basic things. And all of these are important attributes or important bits of data related to the transaction, some more important than others. But are they the only bits of data which are relevant to the transaction? I would argue absolutely not. There are loads of different bits of data which range from just kind of relevant to the transaction all the way through to critical to the transaction. We're not going to work through all of these in any detail, but things like the credit check, I would argue, is relevant data. It's all data. It's relevant to the transaction. I would also argue that things like affordability by the customer, from a compliance perspective, is relevant information to the transaction. It's relevant data. Possibly the sales process or the advice that the customer was given or the customer's response to the advice may be relevant data to the transaction. And all of those are relevant today, I would argue. In the future, there are going to be all sorts of other kinds of data which are relevant or possibly even critical to the transaction. Things like biometrics, the near-field information on your passport, things like voice data or even your fingerprint. And so if all of this data is relevant or ranging from relevant to critical, what do we do with it? We've established that data is our stock in trade. What do we do with our stock in trade? How do we treat it? Well, today, we stick it in a variety of places, a whole range of different places. And these places have kind of grown tactically over the years. And, some of it we stick in a CRM system. Some of it they'll be in a database somewhere with IT. Some of it is with third parties. People maybe like e-sign providers or vaulting providers or storage providers or credit bureaus. Some of it is in data warehousing. Some of it, frankly, we've lost. I was with, a year ago, the head of digital for a top 5 high street bank that will remain nameless. And his problem was that he didn't know where all of the data pertaining to each of his retail loan transactions was. He couldn't find it all. This is a top 5 bank. He couldn't find it all, let alone prove that it was all linked. I phoned up Dave Fletcher, our sales director. They're now a client. But what was interesting about that is this guy was paid to know, he didn't know. And so all of this data is in lots of different places. And that's a problem. But the problem, if you are remotely large or if you're growing, is massively magnified with scale and time. So What really is the problem? Well, what you have here as a business, even though chunks of that data is structured data, sure, CRM, on a macro level, this is unstructured data. It's data in multiple different formats. It's data in multiple different locations. It's data with multiple different security treatments. The vast majority of that data has zero integrity, i.e. it has nothing proving that the data hasn't changed or couldn't have changed. What we're looking at, and I'll be very surprised if any lender in this room wasn't somewhere on this scale. What you're looking at here is really a system of reference that has grown up tactically in iterations over many, many, many years. A system of reference. What it absolutely is not is a long-term and strategic system of record. And if data is your stock in trade, not to have a strategy around a system of record seems at the very least remiss. So what's the alternative? Well, an alternative clearly is not to change all of this data infrastructure, to change all of these processes. I mean, that's an ocean for someone to boil maybe in the future. Let's go back to the data which is relevant to that particular transaction. And let's say, yes, we keep it in all of those other places that we use on a day-to-day basis, CRM, et cetera, as a kind of system of day-to-day record. But let's say, additionally, we want to create a system of reference. Additionally, we want to create a system of record, rather like you might leave a photocopy of your will with your solicitor and he'll stick it in a safe, or she'll stick it in a safe. So let's say that we call that a packet, for want of a better phrase. Let's say we stick all of the data which we think is either crucial or even relevant or even useful to that particular transaction in the packet, in the same packet. So now we're thinking about this packet concept. And that leads us on to think, okay, if that seems like a good idea on a transaction-by-transaction basis, what attributes, if we're thinking about a long-term strategic system of record underpinning your entire business in perpetuity, what kind of attributes does this packet need to have? And a starter for 10, I don't know all of the answers to this, but at least I would believe it should be data agnostic. You have all sorts of different data that might be relevant. You don't even know about different data formats in the future that you might want to stick in that packet. So it should accommodate anything from a voice file to a video to a contract, pretty much anything. The second thing is, ideally, you would want to be able to confer integrity to that packet. You would want to be able to prove that the data that's in the packet not only didn't change, but couldn't have changed by accident or design. If you can't prove that, then the data is a lot kind of less reliable, less provably reliable. Traditionally, PKI has been used to do that for contracts, largely not because of technical reasons, but because of legal reasons. A lot of legal infrastructures and laws in the UK and Europe particularly kind of mandated use of PKI technology, but it works. Then you have things like data security. I think that's obvious. We won't unpack that. But you also have things like data independence. As a financial institution, you should have all that data. You should not be reliant upon any third party at any point in the life of that data to do anything with the data. You should own it, like cash. And then, it should be easy to store. There are certain formats that lend themselves to long-term storage and certain formats that don't. PDFs, for example, do. Others may not be so effective. You also want the data to be easy to find. If you don't have good metadata around your data, you just create a kind of ongoing ballooning problem for yourself. You want it to be easy to use. Again, that sounds obvious, but when I say easy to use, I mean easy to use by the non-technical. You shouldn't, over time, engender an increasing dependency on IT to access your stock in trade. Use your stock in trade or explain your stock in trade to customers or regulators or dealers or anybody. And IT doesn't want that problem, frankly. Lastly, packet relationships. What do I mean by that? You may want to prove relationships or have packets associate themselves with other packets. Example, I want to go and find all of the packets related to this particular dealer or customer or over this particular time period. The packets should probably be able to interrelate in some way. And blockchain just happens to be a very convenient and useful way of proving the interrelationship and integrity of those relationships between packets or any kind of chunks of data over a long period of time. So in conclusion then, if we accept the fundamental principle, which I believe is true, that we are all building businesses built upon the foundations of data, then it follows that our businesses are only as robust as those foundations. No data, no business. If that's the case, then really data and data strategy is absolutely core to corporate strategy, and if it isn't, it probably should be. So what's the message in all of this? Well, the message is simple. Have a strategy around data. And just for a fun parting thought, in November of last year, IBM produced a 50-qubit quantum computer. Some of you will know what quantum computing is. Today you're reliant upon bits, which are binary. The replacement to the bit will be the qubit. And in the world of the qubit, there is no such thing as binary. There are infinite different possibilities, which creates an order magnitude, several orders magnitude, greater compute power, more efficiency, and it's better for the environment. Electrons will be gone. You'll be using photons to process all of your data. That all sounds very, very cool. What does it mean to you? What it means to you is as soon as quantum computing is a reality, and it's already a reality on a small scale, every single tenet on which you've built your data security around encryption is gone. I can instantly decrypt the most complex cryptographic algorithm, and all of your data security is undermined. It doesn't mean that you can't do something about it, but you need a strategy. And so really, that's my message. Have a strategy. Thank you very much.